bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 106 today, talking about a subject that you probably haven't heard about, talked about, thought about much before. Perhaps it's the topic of plural marriage or polygamy. I'm joined here in the Libertas studio by a friend and polygamist, Joe Darger. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you and I have talked quite a bit before, and obviously a lot of our listeners are outside of Utah, so they may have never been familiar with this, whereas my hunch is, in-state, it's more familiar or known at least. Maybe let's talk about just the geographic footprint. It seems like most folks who practice polygamy are perhaps concentrated in, the Mormon corridor. Is this a practice that's more dispersed geographically than that?
It actually is. In fact, Mark Henkel runs a Christian polygamy group, gets really irritated how much press and attention Mormon polygamists get, because that is the social narrative. People think of Mormonism and then goes to polygamy, and they think of Utah. In actuality, although there is certainly a concentration of polygamous people from Mormon roots here, given there's interesting enough, a lot of Christian polygamists, people that are from a Christian background that practice polygamy from historical, biblical traditions. And then there's also, of course, a lot of Muslims. We've had a lot more Muslim people come to our country from immigration. And even in the state of Utah, we've had social groups, some NGOs and other type of organizations that have reached out for what we've done, because they're dealing with African immigrants and Muslim immigrants that are here in Salt Lake City that now are dealing with polygamous situations. So, the narrative is it's all here, but certainly it's estimated there's between 38 to 50,000 polygamists in the Intermountain West. Now,
how do other states deal with it, right? Because here in Utah, there was the whole Edmunds-Tucker Act and all this federal enforcement. They required Utah to have, in pursuit of statehood, to put in the Constitution that polygamy is banned. My sense is that in other states where it wasn't really historically an issue, that's not so much an issue. So the Christian, the Muslim, and even Mormon polygamists scattered elsewhere in other states, are their laws much different than Utah's, which makes it a felony to be a polygamist? What does that look like elsewhere?
It's really quite diverse when we've studied it, but it certainly is the law in Utah and Idaho, which had some Utah Mormon influence,
right?
Are very unique in how they went about dealing with the, quote, polygamy problem. Polygamy is one of those things that's very hard to criminalize, because what is polygamy? There's bigamy. There's a legal marriage of more than one person. But for a lot of polygamists, they were not getting legal marriages. So then how do you go after this idea of what is a polygamous relationship? And so they first started with cohabitation. It was unlawful cohabitation, and that was the original federal law, was the cohabitation aspect. And that in itself had some problems, especially as anyone with a mistress is cohabitating. How do you define that?
Hugh Hefner.
Yeah. So they got really clever here in Utah, and they said, well, we're going to go after people who are purporting to be married and cohabitating. And so this purport clause is a very interesting fact of Utah history. You don't see that in a lot of other states. In some states, they don't address it. There's just simply a bigamy statute, which is what we'd prefer.
Multiple marriage licenses.
Yeah, like in North Dakota. It's more of traditionally a crime of fraud. Somebody come in and they were already married, and then they got another marriage license to try to...
They're deceiving one spouse while trying to get another spouse, whereas that's not the case in a polygamous context. I guess let me launch off of that to ask, in a post... how do you pronounce that? I always Obergefell, or the United States Supreme Court has ruled that same-sex marriage is legal. So in a society that now has had to deal with that ruling and nationwide acceptance of sanctioned, licensed same-sex marriages. How are polygamists feeling? Is it that you're feeling left out? Do you think that that's a step towards the inevitability of multiple marriage licenses for polygamy? What's the outlook there?
Well, I think going back to the 2003 Lawrence decision, there was certainly this idea of, how do you criminalize what's going on in the bedroom? And that certainly has spilled out into the polygamist communities where we're like, how does this not apply to us? And now with even gay marriage, I think even in my own development has certainly been, I've always been just about decriminalization and just
leave us alone.
Just leave us alone and let us be. And I think that's still where I'm at. But there's now, as I look at the shifting culture and laws going, there's more of a push to say, well, why doesn't that apply?
Mm-hmm.
They'll have different marriage licenses. So it'll be interesting to see how the next generation picks that up. Well, I'm still stuck on just decriminalizing us.
Get off my lawn.
Just leave us alone. Because the idea that we're criminalized just for speaking, for calling my wives wives, is something that Utah in particular is stuck with. You don't see that in a lot of other states. Sometimes, interestingly, in Massachusetts, the word polygamy is actually used. Polygamy is against the law.
Now, here in Utah, when Cody Brown was going to be prosecuted, and of course he's got his TV show, a lot of people are familiar with him, Sister Wives, they fled to Vegas, right? That's where they moved. So are the laws in Nevada much more laissez-faire then?
Yeah. A lot of laws in different states just do not address it. They just have bigamy. So if you're going in there and, it's just like somebody having a girlfriend on the side.
Which is Nevada in a nutshell.
Nevada in a nutshell. So Nevada was a safe place, I think, for them to go. And also they felt like anything far as the 10th district versus, the Nevadas in the California district.
Right.
So I think there were some strategic reasons why they went there. And they even found they felt a lot more accepted. I mean, one of the myths people have from outside of Utah is that we're very pro-polygamy here. But much like I think in many places where you're dealing with a minority culture, it's actually more oppressive. Like people have more stereotypes because they're dealing with the stereotypes of what they see. And there's a little defensiveness that comes into this culture where if I travel and I have my family in California, for example, people think maybe I'm a school group. They may comment, but they're not as mean or angry or judgmental as you see here in Utah.
Now, you talked a moment ago about strategic reasons, and you've had your own, right? Because your family has taken made the decision to be very public. You wrote a book, Love Times 3. Mm-hmm. You've done a number of interviews on national TV. You did an interview with us. We'll link to these on the show notes page for today, which is societyandthestate.com/106. And so talk to me about that decision, because I can imagine that there was a bit of fear of being cast as the other and kooky. And a lot of people's perception of polygamy is like the yearning for Zion raid, right, and all the supposed child molestation happening, child brides, Warren Jeffs. So in a culture, in a zeitgeist where polygamy is equated with, that type of taint, what was the strategic reason why you guys decided to be so outspoken about your family? Well,
it's an interesting journey for us in that, like anything, you don't always know what you start when you start something. Mm-hmm. We originally got involved because of the death of our daughter, clear back in 2001, and we realized, we had the state discrimination. We had to have the state come in, threaten to take away our daughter. They felt our other kids, because of the loss of our daughter, they felt like we were something wrong with us because they're polygamists, and we somehow had some medical neglect, and they didn't find anything. But that experience was so traumatizing to us as parents when we lost a child. Like any parent would go through that trauma, and then to have the added fear that you grew up your whole life that the state would somehow come in and take your kids or treat you differently or arrest you because of your lifestyle. And that led me down a slippery slope, if you will, in my own path, because I just realized that this idea that we were just, if we didn't say we were polygamists, if we didn't purport to be married, then they couldn't arrest us, just wasn't working. And so after that, we decided we needed to speak up and really understand and help state agencies understand who we were and who we are. And that had led to us to doing a photo cover with my wives, which led to Big Love being inspired when they did their show. And it just kept leading down a path. And we would make progress. And every time we did, we had this character that I'm sure you've heard about named Warren Jeffs. Kind of up the ante, and the negative just kept getting more and more, and that became the narrative. And so finally in 2010, we wrote the book, and that was the first time I personally became public. Because for polygamous men, to speak up could cost you your job at the very least, or your, financially, but certainly they are the men, us are the ones that are the ones.
You're the target of the law.
You're the target of the law.
Yeah. And
so until the recent change, they changed it to he or she now. But it's traditionally been men in that regard. And so at that time, it was very terrifying. I think back to 8 years ago, and it's just amazing how I've evolved and grown. But at that time, we were very afraid, and as were the Browns for good reason. That was about the same time we worked with the Browns. They were coming out with the show the same year we did, and the show came out just before our book got released. And, of course, they did get threatened and investigated, and they left. And at that time, we made a choice. I remember talking to Cody in January or February of 2010 when he just said, our attorneys advise us to go. If we have any chance at any of this, we need to leave. And we as a family talked, what are we going to do? Our book was about to come out. It was in the process of getting published. And so those were very terrifying times for us as a family. Of course, our oldest kids were just going into high school at that time, and we were just like dealing with what's the impact of them and what are we going to do. Of course, now you're looking backwards and go, well, what was the big deal? But I was very afraid, and it was a very fearful time, rather. And for a lot of polygamists, they're still in that, and that's why we keep standing in it.
But let's expound on that, because the listener might be saying, like, okay, big deal. Why? There's all sorts of laws on the books that aren't enforced, right? I mean, in many states, adultery is illegal, and yet you don't see people thrown in jail for adultery. But so help the listener understand why that fear is rational, given the generations of legal persecution and enforcement that there has been on this issue.
Yeah, I think for anyone that grew up in this culture, law enforcement or the authorities was not looked upon kindly, because for my grandfathers, they were all in prison. They were in prison for polygamy. And then going back to even my mother-in-law was 10 years old when her family was raided, and she was taken to Phoenix. She was in Shore Creek, Arizona at the time. And that trauma and that fear lives on within that. And then even recently, where you've had people, just like we dealt with the fear of the state coming in with our kids, and there was other families that maybe would have medical emergencies or things that happen in their family, and the narrative being, oh, you guys are an abusive family, then they get dealt with differently than somebody that did not come from a plural family. And so those fears are very real. I've come to learn that that the state fears us more than we should fear them. But not everyone that has grown up in that culture shares that. And so we have just stood in the forefront of that, along with the Browns and some others that have been willing to come public to say, no, we need to change this. And I'm grateful for my first generation of kids. They're now, I have grandkids now, and we look back 8 years later, and those kids grew up differently than my kids now coming through school. I have kids in junior high and elementary, and they can talk openly about who they are and their parents because we have been so open about it.
And as part of that, one of the comments that I've gotten from people who meet you through our work in trying to change the law or see your video, again, that we'll link to on societyandthestate.com/106, is that you're normal. Like, you don't come across like a Warren Jeffs. You're just a normal dude. You build homes. You know, we've been in your home. The kids are well cared for. Everyone, lots of love going around. Everyone's helping make dinner. I imagine the logistics of dinner are quite staggering compared to any other family, but it's not like that's bad. It's just on a, higher scale than anybody else. So, what is that like, right? Because you're being cast with a stereotype that does not represent, who you are or the way your family is, or many other families who are kind of hiding in the shadows. And as much as our listeners might be thinking like, no, I just can't shake off the polygamy vibe, that style, what's your message to those people who look at you and even though you're normal, they just kind of have that?
How we other people, like we do it with polygamists, we'll do it with race, we do it in to marginalize and push people as something that's different than how we look at life as different. But in the end of the day, we have more similarities than we are differences, than we are different in. And I think that's what gets lost in even the politics of today. And we don't sit down and actually talk about solutions. We talk about being right with each other. And I think, when people start seeing our family as a family, and where before we were afraid to show people that we were a family. It was, so the more that other people, and that is the impact of the law. When you give a legal license, you now have made it okay for people to discriminate or treat somebody as marginalized. And that happens, I think, with illegal immigrants, We kind of get lost on it. Well, they're illegal. Well, they're people trying to do the best they can. And so if we look at them as something different rather than that they're a human being, then it's easy to marginalize them. It doesn't excuse anything, and I've never excused that we are breaking the law in living plural marriage. I'm open about that. But
much less all the abuse, which you repudiate, right? There are problems that need to be dealt with.
And if you can deal with that, though, those are the stereotypes. And we let stereotypes, whether it be racial or religious or political stereotypes, run the gamut instead of dealing with those aberrations and looking at people as people. And I think that's the message that is powerful even with us, is like looking at that, because polygamy, I mean, we as a history of this country and the Constitution really guaranteed liberties and religious liberties so long as they were traditional Christian ones. And I think we struggled if they were Native American, if they were Muslim, if they were polygamist, atheist. And so, it applies across the board, but we're okay when it's white Christian traditionally, but we get challenged sometimes when we're allowing other beliefs that maybe don't look at it. But at the end of the day, we are all people, and this country is great because of the diversity, because we allow conflicting and competing ideas to exist in the marketplace and say, what works for one may not work for everyone, but we're a better nation for that.
Joe Darger, thanks for joining us on Society and the State.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.